Recently, as you saw in my previous video, a lot of people are displeased with the Cambridge University. But the reality is that the Cambridge University was always a hotbed for Marxists, political agitators, and even Soviet spies. But sometimes, all of them at once. And the hilarious thing is that when you called them out, when you pointed the obvious, they would call you a conspiracy theorist. They would say that you're crazy, you're making things up. It's an excuse they used then, and it's probably an excuse that they would use now. But since KGB has uncovered its secret documents, today we know the truth. We know about the Magnificent Five. So the Magnificent Five were spies for the USSR operating as Cambridge University teachers and also as political agitators. They were heavily convinced that the Marxist-Leninist of Soviet communism was the best available political system in the world, and that it was also the only system which can abolish fascism. Now you need to understand this is a trick that Marxists use. Their definition of fascism is very different than that of the common person. The common person understands fascism as a state that is devoid of freedoms, personal liberties, human rights. It is a system led by a dictator. And as such, most people do not want to lose their liberties, so they will actively oppose such a system. However, for the Marxists, the definition of fascism means capitalism. And you can understand why they project to have higher numbers than they actually do. Because when they say we need to rise up against fascism, people will use the normal person definition. It's like, yeah, of course, we don't want to live under a dictatorship. But the same people love living under capitalism, and they wouldn't join the struggle if they knew that the struggle is actually meant to take down capitalism. And Marxists wouldn't have to use these cheap tactics if they actually had the majority, if their ideology was good. So now you had these Marxist professors on the payroll of the Soviet Union doing agitation and propaganda at universities. In other words, pushing courses that pitted whites against blacks, that pitted rich against poor, that pitted men against women, that pitted the young against the old, and used any type of divisive tactic in order to make the nation less united and more weak. Thousands of parents send their teachers to the University of Cambridge only to have their students indoctrinated into a revolutionary ideology and then go out into the streets getting beaten by the cops and arrested, while these 5 university professors would remain in the safety of the academia, making sure to indoctrinate more youth into their radical agenda. And in one way you have to admire the beauty of these active measures that the Soviet Union employed. The British government would fund these universities from its own pockets to have these Marxist agitators indoctrinate the next generation of youth to actively work against the British government. Parents would willingly send their children to these universities in order to indoctrinate them in an ideology of hate that would most likely have the student turn against the parent. Because you see, the parent is now a fascist, even though he's the one that most likely paid for that person's education. And it's a really wonderful system if you think about it. You get the people of a nation to pay for their own subversion, to pay for the next crisis that's going to come down years later when these students graduate and get into positions of power. So who were these 5 people, these university professors that history has revealed to us? Back in the day, if you were to ask someone about a spy, the most unintelligent person would probably tell you something about James Bond. While the more intelligent people would say, well, it's someone that steals documents, right? In reality, a spy was far more sinister than that. As we're going to see in the case of Guy Burgess and Donald Dewart McLean. These people were a comical bunch, and it was very difficult to suspect them of spying because they were constantly drunk. You could even describe them as bumbling idiots. Burgess is being described as a man constantly under the influence of alcohol. And not only was he constantly drunk, but once when he was leaving a pub, he managed to drop one of the files of documents he had taken from the Foreign Office on the pavement. Meanwhile, the other chucklehead, McLean, was described as quote-unquote not being very good at keeping secrets. He was also constantly drunk and told his lover, as well as his brother, the fact that he is a double agent working for the KGB. But despite all these people alone managed to hand over 389 top secret documents to the KGB in the first 6 months of 1945, along with a further 168 documents in December 1949. Now imagine how difficult it would be to root out similar individuals today. First of all, their active measures of subverting students is not illegal. Holding a course on Marxism and telling students that they live in an oppressive capitalist society that they need to tear it down is not illegal. It is protected speech. And the idea of selling documents to a foreign nation, unless they are caught in the act, unless you have concrete evidence of them doing it, it would be viewed as an attack on academia. If you suggest that these are foreign infiltrators, that these are members working for an opposite state, you would be viewed as a conspiracy theorist and dismissed out of hand. But not only that, the mainstream media, even if the politician that tries to uproot them is in the right, would go on a full campaign against that politician to try and silence and discredit them. And we can see this in the case of Anthony Blunt, which is more of what is the romanticized version of a spy in the minds of many people. This person worked at MI5. He was quite higher up, and he actually dealt more with providing information to the Soviet Union regarding MI5 activities. And he was first called out as being a Soviet agent by investigative journalist Andrew Boyle in his book Climate of Treason. And then in November in 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher admitted to the House of Commons that Blunt had confessed of being a Soviet spy. Why did he confess? Well, because a KGB defector, Anatoly Golitsyn, named him as a Soviet spy. And in exchange for immunity, he decided to spill the beans. However, the people interrogating said that he would only reveal secrets when pressed with undeniable evidence, and he was very reluctant to do so. The reason for doing this is that most of these spies were not just motivated financially or by the positions of power that they held. They also had an ideological motivation. You see, they genuinely believed in the cause. They genuinely believed that Marxist-Leninism is the best governance system that Britain should adhere to. And this is why these people were so dangerous. Because it's very easy to get someone that's motivated by wealth or power to talk, but it is almost impossible to get someone that's ideologically possessed to spill the beans. What's fascinating about this is that the Soviet Union did not have to send its own people abroad in order to infiltrate high positions of power. While this happened every now and then, what they would focus on would be to channel their active measures through the people that they had in the media, through the authors and movie makers, in order to push Marxist-Leninist ideology onto the people. And eventually, people in high positions of power would start being influenced by this ideology and legitimately believe that the Soviet Union is the only way through which Marxist-Leninist ideology can be imported in the West. And it was those people that would contact the Soviet government willingly and provide their services. Now, there are other members to this group, such as John Cairncross, and obviously, despite the fact that the name is called the Big Five, the spy network is a lot larger. No one knows the full extent of it, how many students got converted to this ideology, and then not even knowingly that they are Soviet spies would go on in various positions of power as they graduate university and start getting jobs as lawyers, as doctors, as university professors, or as people in the mainstream media, would try to subvert the nation due to their indoctrination, being useful idiots and unaware they are actually helping a foreign state. But the idea is very interesting because Cambridge University wasn't the only institution co-opted. Book writers, movie makers, people in politics, people in the media, all of them had Soviet agitators working within their ranks, whether directly for the Soviet Union or being ideologically possessed and indoctrinated into Marxist ideology. Once these people got into a position of power, whether it was in a company or a government institution, they would actively try to recruit and promote other people that were ideologically inclined into Marxism and make life very difficult for people that were pro-capitalist, pro-democracy, pro-Britain. Not only that, but they would also work simultaneously in order to combat the efforts of people trying to expose this. The idea of the Red Scare was popularized by the mainstream media as they would try to diminish or gaslight people that were calling this out. A politician that would try to put under investigation journalists or people in the academia was viewed as a fascist, as someone who tries to stamp free speech. And we have the benefit of being able to look into the past at history and look at the KGB uncovering their secret files, or look at KGB defectors naming these people out and seeing that this was a trend. We noticed that the Soviet Union would pump money into this in order to push these active measures and try to destabilize nations, so that the nations are weakened on an international scale, as they have to constantly fight in order to quench the struggles within their own borders rather than to unite their efforts against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was using a firm fist in order to crack down on its population, to make absolutely sure that dissent cannot happen within the Soviet Union. It would often criticize on an international scale capitalist nations that would put their own university professors or journalists on trial for being Soviet spies, and claim how these countries do not respect human rights, how they do not respect free speech, how they do not respect the freedom of the press, while the Soviet Union itself always respected the freedom of the press, because the press was under Soviet control.